Okay, I think we should make a start now. Hello everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to the fifth webinar of the 2020-2021 EPRC seminar program. If you have been with us previously, you might know that. Will be in normal circumstances, these seminars take place face-to-face at our premises at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And in the current circumstances, we are keen to deliver them online and welcome you from different ends of Europe or even beyond today, or also at our future seminars. My name is Nelly Georgieva. I'm a research associate at the European Policies Research Center, and I'll be your host today. So today's seminar is devoted to the topic of spatial justice and whether it could be an alternative to territorial cohesion alongside EU goals of economic and social cohesion. Or it's another fuzzy concept, as our speaker will highlight at her intervention today. So for today's topic, we invited Dr. Bryonny Goodwin-Hawkins, and she will be sharing with us recent research on spatial justice. It's great to have you with us, Bryonny, and thanks for joining us. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to inform you that this session is being recorded, and this means that you can follow it later on or share it with your colleagues and your contacts. You will be able to find it on our YouTube channel, so check it out. But also be sure that we will send you a link by email, so no worries, you will receive it. We would also encourage you to share your thoughts on Twitter and social media, and that would be great as well. In terms of our agenda today, we will have the presentation of Dr. Bryonny Goodwin-Hawkins in a minute, and this would take around 30 minutes. Depending on the time left. After that, we will open the floor for your contributions, for your questions and reflections on her research. And then we aim to wrap up around 1 o'clock UK time. Our seminars are intended to be interactive and participatory, so feel free and very much encouraged to post your questions in the chat while Bryonny is presenting. You can see the chat box at the bottom menu, or also raise your virtual hand, and you can see that if you click on participants, there would be blue hand at the bottom. If these icons are not that easy to find, also please feel free to raise physically your hand when we open the floor for Q&A. And if you're not speaking, please keep your microphone on mute, as you, I'm sure, know very well by now. So let me present our speaker today, Dr. Bryonny Goodwin-Hawkins. She's a senior research fellow at the Countryside and Community Research Institute, an affiliate of the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data. Her interdisciplinary work spans rural and regional studies. And she has been contributing to a number of Horizon 2020 projects, such as IMAJINE and RELOCAL. And she is currently operational lead for the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise and in Southwest England. So once again, it's great to have you with us. Bryonny, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Nelly, and I hope everyone can hear me properly. Please let me start by making two apologies. The first is that I currently have an electrician in my house. So if there is suddenly banging and crashing behind me or my internet disappears because the power is gone out, I apologize in advance. The second apology is that I'm not going to show you a slideshow. I am going to read to you my thoughts as I have been working on them, but I will try not to be incredibly dull, and I will also try to slow down so that you can understand me. I'm currently here in Wales as well, so hello Scotland and the rest of Europe. Okay, so let me start. In the heady year of 1968, the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre championed the right to the city, the rights of people to access and use urban space. For Lefebvre, when economic inequalities, social discrimination, or state act obstructed these rights, spatial injustice was created. Over the past decade, the concept of spatial justice has been academically revisited, particularly in geography and planning, as a normative ideal associated with progressive politics. Following Lefebvre's lead, the new wave of scholarship has also begun with cities. Yet there have been recent calls to regionalise spatial justice and a related turn to rural spatial justice. My own work with the Horizon 2020 IMAJINE project has looked to spatial justice as an addition or perhaps even an alternative to current policy approaches to territorial cohesion in the EU. This is new, but not completely. 15 years ago, Simone Davudi observed of the then emerging concept of territorial cohesion that it, and I quote her, added a spatial justice dimension to European spatial policy, extending an emphasis on equity to territorial development. We can probably agree now that the potential of this vision has not really been realised. In the Brexit era, whether cohesion policy can buy the EU equity, let alone love, has been open to question, as populist parties loudly question the European project's viability against a politicised background of rising inequalities. Now, these simmering issues, together with the current pandemic, do suggest, I think, the need to move beyond current approaches to territorial cohesion and towards alternative ambitions for addressing regional disparities. There is evidence that the European Commission itself has been seeking spatial justice, including through the Horizon call that led to IMAJINE and our sister project RELOCAL, which looks at LEADER. So in my talk today, I will introduce you to spatial justice and offer an overview of the regionalised approach. And I'm going to be drawing particularly from a paper that Rhys Jones, Mike Woods and I published earlier this year in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. I'm going to situate that approach, as we did in the paper, within the realm of cohesion policy, and specifically in comparison to territorial cohesion as it is currently operationalised. But I do want to come back to what for me is often a still nagging question. We know that territorial cohesion has attracted academic attention as a fuzzy concept, one that is difficult to define or identify. If a spatial justice approach is to offer a real alternative, could it bring clarity, or are we at risk of simply giving new words to old confusions? Let me start with a brief overview of spatial justice. The concept has an entry point and two fundamental concerns. The entry point is that spatial inequalities exist, yet are not inevitable. The two fundamental concerns are, first, how spatial patterns of inequality are produced and perpetuated, and second, how more just outcomes might be achieved. Now, as I've noted, the concept emerged in the late 1960s, primarily through Marxian theorists echoing contemporary anti-capitalist protests by arguing for a necessary transition to a more just urban society. Lefebvre's right to the city meant the right to participate in urban transformation processes. Similarly, David Harvey viewed the city as at once the manifestation of modern injustice and the site of emergent alternatives. Urbanism has also motivated more recent interest in spatial justice, with two key texts published in the past decade. Susan Feinstein's The Just City celebrated urban diversity and argued for redistributing resources and opportunities. Edward Soja's Seeking Spatial Justice advocated spatial rights as a normative ideal and illustrated the processes that create urban injustice. Soja usefully defined spatial justice as the fair and equitable distribution in space of socially valued resources and the opportunities to use them. The contemporary literature also adds a crucial point. Space is more than a container for social and economic processes. Although the right to space is experienced by different people in different ways that are socially and economically structured, to talk about spatial justice must be to talk about more than social justice or economic justice in space. And I'll come back to that. But at this point, I want to turn to scale. Despite the city's struggles and social movements spatial justice has emerged from, there is no necessary link between spatial justice and the urban scale. Soja wrote that justice and injustice are infused into the multi-scalar geographies in which we live. And since spatial justice celebrates the right to define and participate in just transitions, it follows that justice could and should be defined in different spaces and at different scales. Yet, if we need not view spatial justice as exclusively urban, we do need to recognise that spatial injustices do not necessarily play out in the same ways at other scales. Understanding the implications of this change of scale is part of the challenge that regional and rural approaches to spatial justice take up, and I'll turn to those now. Now, at last year's European Society for Rural Sociology Congress, I co-convened a working group on rural spatial justice, or what we were thinking through there as the right to the country. The starting point for our discussion was that we know that the distribution of access and resources is at least as significant in the country as in the city, if not more so. Hence, putting spatial justice in rural perspective involves asking questions about how the unequal distribution of rights and resources affects the ability of individuals to access, inhabit, and use rural spaces. But that is not necessarily straightforward. For example, we can interrogate how classifications of rural and urban function to reproduce inequalities by making differing assumptions about what each does and needs. We might then rail against the kinds of policies and government decisions that effectively assume that lower standards for service provision are acceptable in rural areas. But we can also get stuck in an impasse over whether the higher costs of rural service equity are actually a just price. So what is now a growing literature on rural spatial justice has largely been concerned with development Uneven development marks a departure point for regional approaches too. But as in the rural case, merely counting resources by region is far too simplistic here. Indeed, this would return us to a very limited view of space as a container for metrics and indicators. We should, I think, take care with assuming that a spatially even distribution of wealth and resources is the normative ideal we're looking towards, particularly because justice has plural and contextual rather than universal meanings. Now, of course, freedom and liberty, the ability to live our lives and be happy, are aspirations we all surely share. But as Amartya Sen has pointed out, there is no single perfectly just imaginary against which all realities everywhere can be compared and counted. Spatial justice scholars do draw on different theories of justice, but the idea of justice as plural has brought some, including myself, towards Sen and Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach to development. My recent article with Jones and Woods pulled capabilities into play by arguing for a regionalised spatial justice based on 3 premises. The first premise is that regions should be able to assert their own capacity to actively define and pursue justice. The second premise is that promoting justice must involve considering the implications of space and scale, including rural and urban differences. And the third premise is that regions should be able to define well-being, development, and the good life in ways that reflect their priorities and capabilities. So we drew from research for the IMAJINE project in Wales, where I am now. Wales has faced and continues to face persistent inequalities, stemming from historical, geographical, and economic causes, amongst others. These inequalities have for some time fueled internal narratives of a dependent poor country and external views of a lagging region that must catch up. Yet our research with Welsh policymakers identified a transition among them from claiming Welsh problems as a lever on resources towards enabling regional capacities to act. We saw a transition as well towards the emergence of new spaces and scales of governance, replacing regions formerly instrumentally defined to contain metrics and attract funding. And we saw a move towards a redefinition of progress beyond macroeconomic indicators, and most notably through the Welsh Government's flagship Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. In the article, we did not contend that these shifts embody spatial justice, but we do view them as positive steps in public policy that suggest possibilities for regional development approaches that might in future be more directly informed by spatial justice. And we drew a contrast between these approaches and how territorial cohesion has been operationalised to date and brought into Wales. So let me put spatial justice momentarily on hold while I bring in territorial cohesion. Now, as you will know, cohesion policy is one of the EU's largest budget lines, and it's really central to the European philosophical project, promising to, in the Commission's words from many years ago, give to the people of Europe a unique blend of economic well-being, social cohesiveness, and high overall quality of life. Uneven development has long been challenging in this sense, and the roots of an explicit approach to territorial cohesion, alongside existing goals for social and economic cohesion emerge really in the 1990s, appearing in the Maastricht Treaty's agenda to reduce regional disparities in levels of development, and running through the Treaty of Amsterdam, and perhaps also the European Spatial Development Perspective. Into the new millennium, the third report on economic and social cohesion called for a more balanced development, achieved by reducing existing disparities, preventing territorial imbalances, and making both sectoral policies which have a spatial impact and regional policy more coherent. With the 2007 Lisbon Treaty, territorial cohesion became what we might think of as cohesion policy's third pillar. And this was cemented really with the Leipzig agenda's ideals for polycentric development and regional solidarity. The following year, in 2008, the Commission released the Green Paper on territorial cohesion, noting the particular challenges of rural and less developed regions. By the Europe 2020 strategy, territorial cohesion had become firmly located within priorities for inclusive growth, which is more or less where we are still, albeit arguably greener. So this potted policy history would seem to suggest that a well-developed conceptualization and a clear direction. Yet, while territorial cohesion has been formalized within cohesion policy, there are no explicit guidelines for implementation. In 2008, the year of the Green Paper, the Commission's own InfoRegio magazine reported on a conference under the strapline, "Territorial Cohesion. We think we want it, but we're not sure what it is." Now, some would doubtless disagree, but I think this is probably still a valid commentary. And it's certainly fair to say that the academic literature has developed a minor industry in interpreting what territorial cohesion could or should mean. The literature has two threads. The first is how territorial cohesion is conceptualized, and the second, how it is operationalized. In each, territorial cohesion does appear differently. In the first is full of, albeit fuzzy, potential, and in the second is a far more narrow practicality. I want to start with the second, the operationalization, by way of showing what has become, I think, the intervention point for spatial justice advocates. And I will return to the first a little later to think through the implications of that intervention. So, in practice, ambitions for territorial cohesion are driven through structural funds, primarily the ERDF. Funding allocation mechanisms operate according to differences in GDP between NUTS2 regions, following a map of Europe that compares every region against an average. Effectively then, territorial cohesion is seen and measured at Commission level through regional macroeconomic performance and remedied through growth. In policy, GDP disparities are not necessarily considered problematic in themselves, but rather the problems that tend to be posed by underperforming, so-called lagging regions, is that by not fulfilling the economic potential they are assumed to have, they will undermine Europe's competitiveness and financially burden net paying states, not to mention threaten political revenge. Now, an argument sometimes made here is that territorial cohesion really turns the EU into a geopolitical object that can be mapped and measured and acted upon. I want to leave that Europeanization debate aside and instead focus more specifically on the part played by GDP. So, for many spatial justice scholars and others besides, part of the trouble with an economic geography measured by GDP is that it turns some regions into the normative standard while others become problematic by comparison. Indeed, measuring development according to the figures already set by the most successful regions is to put the others into an economic race that has not only already actually been won, but has a retreating finish line. There is a risk that these kinds of comparisons will actually reproduce rather than redress inequalities, in part because viewing GDP as defining success or failure is viewing development and well-being in narrow ways that can offer little scope for alternatives. GDP has received increasing critique as an inadequate measure of prosperity. Nussbaum, for example, writes that real human importance is located not in GDP, but elsewhere. And recall that I mentioned her work a little bit earlier in relation to the capabilities approach to development. For Nussbaum and others within that approach, abandoning universalizing assumptions about development and justice also requires abandoning macroeconomic measures as the fundamental measures of achievement. This is where those of us advocating a capabilities-inspired spatial justice at a regional scale would argue that we depart from territorial cohesion as it is currently operationalized. Rather than narrow metrics that render regions into containers for GDP, we propose that regionalizing spatial justice by taking a plural approach to progress and prosperity could enable regions to actively define transformative futures for themselves according to their own measures of success and capacities to act. And yet, the regional and rural spatial justice literature is still largely supposition. Scholars are still thinking through the conceptual implications of regionalizing spatial justice, let alone the practical implications, and very little empirical work can attest to the effectiveness of such an approach. Which brings me to the lurking question: how will we know spatial justice when we see it? How do we know it when we see it is the question Anne Markussen puts in her now classic Regional Studies article on fuzzy concepts. In her definition, a fuzzy concept, and I quote, posits an entity, phenomenon, or process which possesses two or more alternative meanings and thus cannot be reliably identified or applied. Fuzzy concepts gain purchase, particularly in policy, because they embrace a multitude of possible meanings. But that also means that fuzzy concepts cannot be coherently applied to guide substantive action or reliably identified in retrospect. Now, territorial cohesion has, in fact, itself been critiqued as a fuzzy concept. And I mentioned earlier that there is a distinction between how territorial cohesion is operationalized through indicators and funding mechanisms, and how it is conceptualized in policy. And there is an interesting tension here, and I want to come back to the conceptualization side. Many scholars have described territorial cohesion as a highly ambiguous concept, in which there is something for everybody. The Commission has remained reluctant to fully define territorial cohesion, and potential meanings have kept expanding in both the policy realm and the academic literature without really much common understanding being found. In reality, most member states and regions get their funding and get on with interpreting territorial cohesion according to their own agendas. This is, in fact, one of the main arguments advanced for keeping the concept fuzzy. Without definition, territorial cohesion is flexible, adaptable into different national jurisdictions and policy contexts, and perhaps even generative. Is this actually what we're asking for when we call for a regionalised spatial justice that enables regions to define their own transformative futures? By putting forward plural definitions of progress, are we simply positing, in Markuson's words again, a process which possesses two or more alternative meanings and thus cannot be reliably identified or applied? In all honesty, my internal jury is still out, and I'm looking forward to passing the question on to you in the discussion. But I want to make 2 points and offer one caution. The first point is that if we simply throw spatial justice into the mix, along with all the other meanings and values that are variously attributed to territorial cohesion, then yes, we will end up with a fuzzy concept. Or rather, nothing will change because that is what we already have. I've argued elsewhere that this kind of cumulative fuzziness, where concepts grow all the broader in possible meaning, largely functions to create more fuzziness. That is, different understandings and interpretations quite obviously lead to different outcomes, and the concepts these outcomes supposedly represent need to stay fuzzy to hold them. Over the longer term, this becomes a cyclical process punctuated by those major reports tasked with cleaning out the conceptual closet. We've seen all this before. But the second point I want to add here is that spatial justice does point to pluralism by design rather than incomparability by accretion. Spatial justice, as my colleagues and I conceive of it, is not about avoiding a shared definition out of political necessity, but enabling multiple definitions out of shared solidarity. It is certainly not about claiming to generate regional responses while really only offering one effective route for measuring progress. But the real challenge here, I think, and one that spatial justice, if nothing else, should help us to reflect on, is to tackle the disconnect between what regions might want to do and be, and what they are expected to do and be. Yet this is where I want to sound that caution. There is a trap awaiting advocates of both fuzzy generativity and of the right to enabled by spatial justice. That trap is romanticizing the bottom up. All too often, we assume that if choices only come from the people, they will be good, right, and just. All too often, we assume that changing scales will produce pre-given values, as though justice was simply a matter of finding the right spatial size. Many examples in the world today should give us pause in thinking that a progressive politics will be magicked at scale. The Polish municipalities that have declared themselves LGBT-free zones, for example, would doubtless argue that they are choosing the transformative futures that they want for themselves. I think this actually could suggest a fruitful direction for spatial justice scholarship, and particularly for those of us departing the city for regions and rural areas. If we are serious about what scale does and how justice works, then we need to seriously contend with injustice and regressive politics. As soon as we deploy spatial justice to analyse inequalities, we deploy value judgments. But inequality is quantitative and can be measured, while injustice is qualitative. It is subjectively perceived and it is powerfully emotive. There is not always a direct correlation between spatial inequalities as they are measured and mapped, and spatial injustices as they are perceived. A politics of discontent is not an inevitable outcome of perceived injustice, but nor is it necessarily solved by the right to pursue justice. Now, I began with 1968 and I want to end there, or rather right here, because building a regional and rural spatial justice scholarship requires us to put down those old protest banners, developing sensitivities to space and to justice, and the complexities that both entangled create. Yes, we need to enable regions to define and pursue justice, development, and the good life in plural ways, reflecting their priorities and capabilities. But we also need to understand how regional scale and rural space reinforce inequalities and injustices. I think we need that nuanced understanding before we can claim an oven-ready policy deal. I don't think we're there yet, but perhaps you might come with me. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryonny. I think that was a very inspiring presentation, and I'm sure that it provoked all of us to consider a different perspective to development and to consider how to approach inequalities. And also, in my view, it places trust to territories, to different territories, to own their own development and to understand their own capabilities and how they can be utilized. Really, really interesting presentation. I think we do not have, or well, I see now that we have one written input in the chat that I will quickly look at. But in the meantime, I would like to open the floor for verbal questions or reflections. Perhaps if you can indicate by raising your hand, even physically. John, would you like to start? I see that you're unmuted, or?
Yes, actually, I think Marcin was in first. Maybe you'd like to turn to him. My question or comment is similar to Marcin's, but perhaps he'd like to lead off.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Bryonny. Hi, and Nelly. Well, I put down my question. There's actually two questions there, but what is puzzling me about this regional dimension of spatial justice is the question of operationalization of the procedural component of spatial justice, because it does have this distributive component, which I think is clear when you think about the regions. It is about kind of related to territorial cohesion, is about a fair distribution of access to services, to public goods, wealth, and so on. But the procedural dimension is about a fair access to decision-making, to having a voice and influence on shaping the future of one's territory. So I'm wondering, what's your thinking about, well, operationalization of this dimension on the regional scale, which tends to be more distant, more abstract to the citizens. In many cases, it's very ill-defined what a region actually is in some countries. So what's your thinking about this? I would be curious to know your thoughts about that. Thanks.
Oh, that's a fantastic question, Marcin. Thank you. Yes, I think you're absolutely right that we can say, look, it's about distribution, but we come back to this question of how do we do it? And this is exactly the question that the Commission is stuck with in many ways as well, and that probably comes out in the Bartka report in terms of saying, well, how are you going to prove that you did add value here? I think this is a question that I'm not going to give you a concrete answer, but you probably guessed that. But I think what a spatial justice approach does give us an invitation to think about is coming back to that question of what is the scale of a region here and what qualifies as a region. If we're saying that a region is not just a container, then that might make us question whether NUTS 2 is the avenue that we want to go down, because NUTS 2 is in many ways a container for a certain population. So first, do we need to do some work around looking at the question of what is the regional scale on which this can be operationalized? And I'm sure everyone in regional studies would say that they've been doing that for about the last 50 years and still haven't figured it out. I think, and I'm quite interested in what I've been doing a little bit of work around is a trend in new localities research in saying, should what we actually be looking at in terms of defining what is a locality in which people can participate is to look at the core rather than the border around it. I want to be careful that that doesn't take us straight to a city region kind of model, because I think from a rural urban perspective, that doesn't work so well. We tend to see a better growth the closer you are to the city. And better participation. But yes, I think there is still a whole lot of research to be done around this exact question of how do we operationalize this. And I think this is what I'm driving at when I say my jury is still out on whether I'm just coming up with another fuzzy concept or actually giving a list of things that can be done. So it's a brilliant question, and actually I'm interested in whether other people have answers or reflections on that myself as I continue to try and work it out.
Thank you, Bryonny. I don't think I have an answer to this. I think it's a real puzzle how to make this meaningful and not kind of undermine you know, the whole architecture of cohesion policy, for example, and we would have to deal with all the path dependencies and there. So I don't have an answer either. So I was wondering if you had some hunches.
I think the answer is that if we had an answer, we wouldn't be here. We'd wouldn't be Ursula von der Leyen.
Thanks.
John, did you want to add, or do you have an answer?
Well, I was going to push the door that Marcin was was pushing ajar a bit, to trying to push that a bit further. I mean, I really enjoyed your presentation and indeed your IGURR, your article, and because there's quite a lot in the sort of place-based debates that that reflects some of the points that you're raising, but I think you put it in a much broader conceptual framework, which I think was really interesting. I particularly liked your discussion of scale and as you called it, the romanticizing of the bottom up, which isn't automatically the answer if you don't set it in the wider debate about what we mean by spatial justice. But looking if in terms of the operationalization of cohesion policy, looking at where we are and where we might build on, either in the context of cohesion policy in the EU 27 or in terms of post-Brexit policy thinking in Wales, just to, where you're obviously working quite a lot. And if you look at the regional capacities to act, the new spaces and scales of governance, and the redefinition of the measures of success, the three key elements of what you were saying. Well, if we had Marc Lemaitre or some of his officials here, they might well be saying, well, we are trying to do some of that. We're trying to build administrative capacity, which isn't the same thing, but nevertheless, it's a very functional technocratic approach. We are encouraging countries and regions to be more flexible in terms of definition of space through integrated territorial development. We are trying to promote more citizen engagement, albeit in quite a clunky, again, quite sort of technocratic way. And we have been looking at different measures of success but within parameters. However, bearing that in mind, it would be interesting to get your view on what you think what would you be recommending to Mark and Lemaitre and his colleagues in terms of of trying to do at least some operationalization of what you've been arguing, or indeed, what would you be saying to Peter Ryland and his colleagues in Wales about post-Brexit policy thinking? Sorry, that's there's quite a lot there, but it was just to extend what Martin was asking about.
Yes, exactly. And I think you pointed out something that I reflect on too, and tried to bring out a little bit in the paper, which is the sense of, are we asking for things that are already there? I think it's a little bit interesting, and I would point to two examples. So the first example I will point to is our work in Wales. What we certainly found, as though I think at Mark's level, you could certainly say these things are there. I think at the experience of the program administration level, certainly in our interviewing, there was the sense that they're not, or at least they're not coming down in the ways that at a higher level they might want to be. Some of the things we were told, for example, was the sense that Wales is pointed to other regions that have developed and improved their GDP and told, oh, why can't you do that? And very much the sense of always being stuck on there. And we also saw too, so I don't know, some of you may be aware that Wales has two NUTS2 regions, and we're east-west. In fact, the boundary is about 2 kilometres that way from where I am sitting right now. And actually that's a really different geography from how Wales is socially and culturally organised, which is north to south. And because that boundary has been quite different, one of our regions is less developed and one of our regions is more developed, there's been a lot of hampering in terms of regions wanting to do projects together. So I think there does need to be a little bit more ironing out around what happens with that. And that would then bring me to another area around Interreg, and particularly the cross-border cooperation. I participated in some research in quite another context in Central Europe and the Austrian and Czech border regions there, where you get quite a lot of Interreg programs that are going on. And the interesting thing, and I still don't have the solution to this either, is that yes, if every region does pursue their own path, what happens if you then say that you want to put two of them together to cooperate? And one of them says, well, is justice for us looks like this and justice for us looks like that. And I think we still need to do a lot more work on, well, how do we enable these pluralist measures while also enabling them to be meaningful in ways that can be shared? And this is, I'm probably going to come back to my answer to Martin's question, which is, I don't know on that, but I think we probably do need to be bumping out of some of the ideas that, I'll rewind a little bit and answer that again. I think what we saw in the Central European research is that a lot of the local stakeholders, and again, looking at a program level, were not identifying that they were getting what they need, and were often saying that they wanted to have more guidance and more ability to compare things. How do we put that in? And how do we make sure that in fact these desires that are coming up from a commission level actually do reach down to program level in ways that are not just experienced, as they also have been in Wales, is more and more demands on developing your indicators. I think we have had issues around the feeling of there being a bit of a vacuum that needs to be filled by more boxes to tick. And I don't think that's worked well, and I think we need to rewind on that. I think we have seen that actually started to happen, and my feeling is we need to look a lot more at how do we pull back from that sense that people are being asked more to make sure that they're actually being given the information they need. I'm not sure if I don't think I answered your question there, John, but I've thrown in a lot more complexity. Yeah.
Thank you, Bryonny, for addressing these challenging questions. But I'm sure that, I mean, this is a topic that certainly will develop in the future as well, and we will know more on it. Are there further questions in the public? If you could, you can also just unmute and ask your question. Feel free to intervene. Okay, then I think, yes.
Can I ask one then?
Yes, I was going ahead with your
I'm curious about how you are actually researching that question in the IMAJINE project. If you could tell us a little bit about that, Bryonny. What can we expect there, and how are you actually investigating this?
Oh, well, I've been involved in how many work packages? 3. One has been around migration, which I'll leave to the side. But I was certainly in the first work package, which was looking at the conceptualizations of territorial cohesion in the national and regional policymakers. So I did a lot of interviewing work around going around Welsh Government offices and asking people how they understand territorial cohesion. And in most cases, actually, they didn't. So we did some large comparative study on that, and those deliverables are online now. You can also get the deliverable that was led by Mikko Wekroth in Helsinki, which was looking at the policy discourses, and particularly they did an analysis of commissioners' speeches around territorial cohesion and how the conceptualization there. There has been another work package which I haven't been involved in, which has been the quantitative work package, and particularly trying to drive down data below NUTS 2 level to look at some of the alternative ways we might see disparities. I believe that's also now available, and some of the qualitative work packages that are coming after that are looking at ways to respond to what we know from this data. As I understand, that data delivery was quite difficult in terms of getting the data and access to it in the first place. We're now looking at, which I will not be involved in because I've jumped ships and projects, a broader work package on actually coming up with those policy mechanisms. So doing exactly what you're asking and trying to head towards the operationalization and doing, and I think they're using within that a lot of scenario building methodologies to bring people together and work through, well, what would this look like and how do you get to it?
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any further questions? John?
Yeah, just a quick question, Bryonny. When you were referring to the artificial division of Wales for structural funds purposes, clearly it was, successful as in Southwest England and in other regions of Europe, that game that's played in order to maximize receipts. I wonder, has that had any legacies in terms of perceptions in the interviews that you did, either a perception of West Wales that as a region that has spilled over into other arenas, either positively, as a way of profiling and giving voice, if you like, or recognition, to maybe parts of the country which felt marginalized, with being peripheral, but in geographically, but feeling also marginalized, or negatively in terms of resentments that, this isn't a region we recognize, and we don't feel that, for in St. David's, we belong with Wrexham or something, with Northwest Wales.
Oh, that's a great question. Certainly at a Welsh government policy level, and I don't think I'm breaching any confidentialities if I say this, there was the overwhelming awareness that it was completely artificial and had been done for the funding. So I very rarely heard anything other than that. I would actually more say people tended to say, well, at least look, maybe one positive outcome that would come from Brexit, and be aware that the Welsh government did not support Brexit, is the possibility of doing another rearrangement of boundaries, which is the process we find ourselves in now. So yes, an absolute awareness that it was artificial, and in that sense, not really that sense of, well, it should be like this. However, there is something interesting which comes up a little bit. There is some suggestion made sometimes that West Wales, not always, but the West tends to be more Welsh speaking than the East, which is closer to the English border. And more Welsh speaking areas were more in favour of devolution in 1997. And there is some sense that part of that boundary creation is slightly to reward the people who were in favour of devolution by making sure they could get more funding. There's very much devolution, and the first big tranche of development funding, EU funding, came into Wales at a similar time, and the Welsh government really pitched itself in that sense as being closer to Europe. So there are some interesting things about what that boundary does historically there. But yeah, certainly no sense that we should have done that differently. And generally you tend to see a sense of people say, well, realistically, the East division is only about getting Cardiff out. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, please, Linda. If I hope that Bryonny has a few minutes more, as we are running after 1 o'clock. Yeah. Okay.
Just a very quick couple of observations, if I may, and mainly to say, Bryonny, thank you so much. That was a really, really interesting presentation with a huge amount of food for thought for us all, I think, there. I just wanted to make a couple of observations from experience and some research across the Highlands and Islands, which would indicate quite a different response from what you just mentioned there in Wales. Now, I'm not saying this is absolutely the case without any exception, but there is definitely more awareness of what the wider benefit of participation in the structural funds programs was. Very much a sort of theme around partnership, and yes, of course, the financial investment was hugely significant, but there was a lot of benefit beyond that as well, which can pick up on. I think that's an interesting discussion. There are lots of things that you mentioned there that resonate as well, particularly talking about the leader experience, and I would relate that to so many issues around capacity, which I think has to be a key part of this discussion here. Similarly, what you mentioned about Interreg and cross-border experiences there would back up a lot of the concerns that you mentioned there. So I can think of loads of evidence to support the questions that you're asking, but unfortunately, no answers so far. So I think we've all got a huge amount of homework to do on this one, haven't we? Interesting what you said about the fuzzy concept, and absolutely agree with what you mentioned there. That was very, very interesting. However, I wondered about if you turn that on its head, and bearing in mind that so much did actually work and was a benefit in the Highlands and Islands, Our concern here now, I'm based in Inverness, our concern now is, well, what is going to replace it post-Brexit? Yes, it's difficult to define what it was, but is it a case of you don't know what you've got till it's gone, and there's concerns about, well, if it's not there, what's going to happen? We are really worried about what is going to replace that, and maybe the lack of the spatial policy issues you mentioned there post-Brexit. So thank you.
No, thanks very much, Linda. Nellie, have I got a few moments to respond? Is that, if other people need to drop off, please go ahead. It's interesting you mentioned the different awareness in the Highlands and Islands, and I mentioned in response to Martine's question about what IMAJINE was doing, that we'd looked at how policymakers in different contexts understand territorial cohesion. And while I got very minimal understanding in Wales, when they did the same thing in Ireland, they had a really strong understanding there, and people were often highly aware of territorial cohesion, whereas in Wales, even if I said cohesion policy, they're like, what? The what? So I think these differences are really interesting, and where they've come from and why is something we still don't understand. I think we're very much in exactly the same position in Wales as saying, well, if this funding is going, what does replace it? And as you probably know, there's been very little noise made on the Shared Prosperity Fund or what's happening around there. And in my current project, NICER, particularly looking at the industrial strategy coming out of Westminster, and there is not, I don't know about Scotland, but Wales is not particularly represented in it, and we don't see a very strong awareness of how other territories that aren't agglomerative centres or part of the car industry really can contribute to that. So I think you're exactly right, and I think this is already what we're seeing as a lot of movement in Wales, and some of those responses by looking at different regions are responding to exactly the idea of what are we going to do if we don't have the funding, and particularly from a Welsh Government perspective, when many programmes have been highly dependent on that. Yeah.
Just a quick point, if I can, Nellie, just in answer to the discussion. Tomorrow, the Scottish Government will be publishing its proposals for the future of the Shared Prosperity Fund in Scotland. This is all subject, of course, to what may be overridden by the UK government through the Internal Market Bill, among other things. But one of the most challenging questions that, without trespassing on discussions within the working group, was about spatial scale and the degree to which existing spatial scales should be challenged by at different levels, particularly at community level, and that's something that is indicated in somewhat neutral terms in the paper. But watch the space.
Sounds like I need to get back on Twitter for tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I think that the fact that we are almost 10 minutes past the end time means that this was really interesting discussion. So thank you, Bryonny, once again for joining us, for sharing your knowledge, and thanks to everyone for the very rich discussion. If you're interested in our webinar series, for those of you who stayed with us until the end, please know that our next webinar takes place next week, 2nd of December. This is Wednesday, and we will have Dr. Maria Saloma, who will be speaking on universities' role in structural funds implementation. So you can subscribe to that webinar using the same contact that you used to subscribe for this webinar. And we will also have future webinars as part of our autumn series that are related to regional development and regional policy. And if you want to subscribe to our mailing list so you receive directly the invitations for these webinars, you can again use the same contact as for subscribing for this webinar, and then we will add you and send you the invitations for the future webinars. Thank you everyone once again, and I wish that we see each other again in the future. Best of luck to Bryonny, and yeah, have a great rest of the day.